Cheryl Ladd entered television history at a moment when very few people would have willingly stepped forward. To the audience, she appeared confident, radiant, and perfectly composed, as if the role had been waiting for her all along. But behind the carefully maintained smile was a woman walking into one of the most emotionally complicated situations of her career. Replacing a cultural icon is never simple, especially when that icon leaves at the peak of public obsession. Cheryl wasn't just joining a popular show. She was stepping into a storm of expectations, comparisons, and unspoken resentment. From the outside, it looked like a dream opportunity. From the inside, it felt more like a trial she wasn't sure she would survive. What unfolded over the years wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, subtle, and far more damaging. And it would shape how Cheryl chose silence as a form of survival rather than retaliation. When the call finally came offering her a role on Charlie's Angels, Cheryl Ladd didn't celebrate the way people expected her to. She understood immediately what the offer truly meant. The show was one of the biggest hits in America, and Farrah Fawcett's departure had shaken its foundation. The network didn't just need a new actress. They needed reassurance, stability, and someone audiences would accept without revolt. Cheryl was not a household name at that time. Her career had been built quietly through voice work, music, guest roles, and steady effort without major recognition. Opportunities were narrowing, and she knew this could be her one real chance. Saying yes meant everything was at stake. Failure would be public. Success would still come with judgment. The pressure began long before she ever stepped onto the set, and she felt it with every decision she made. Producers tried to soften the transition by introducing Cheryl as the younger sister of Farrah's character, rather than a direct replacement. On paper, it was a smart narrative move. In reality, it placed Cheryl in an impossible emotional position. She was constantly compared to someone she wasn't trying to imitate, while being asked to win over fans who were still mourning the loss of another actress. Every smile, every line delivery, every appearance was scrutinized. She walked onto a set already shaped by strong personalities and fragile egos, knowing she would be seen as the symbol of change whether she wanted that role or not. Cheryl did what professionals do. She arrived prepared, stayed polite, worked hard, and never complained publicly. The ratings held steady, the audience adjusted, and the press declared the transition a success. But behind the scenes, something very different was unfolding. Almost immediately, Cheryl sensed that the atmosphere on set was colder than it appeared on camera. Conversations would stop when she entered a room. Breaks felt awkward and isolating. There was no overt hostility, no dramatic confrontations, just a subtle lack of warmth that was impossible to ignore. What should have felt like joining a team felt more like entering territory where she wasn't wanted. The absence of open conflict made it harder to address. You can respond to anger, but you can't argue with silence. Cheryl quickly realized she was not simply the new cast member. She was the reminder that the show had changed, and not everyone was willing to accept that change. The tension lived in unreturned glances and conversations that ended too quickly. Over time, that quiet exclusion became heavier than any argument ever could. One relationship in particular carried an unspoken weight. Kate Jackson wasn't just another star on the show. She was deeply invested in its identity and creative direction. To her, Charlie's Angels was meant to balance glamour with substance, entertainment with emotional grounding. As the series leaned more heavily into style and lighter storytelling, Kate's frustration grew. Cheryl's arrival, fair or not, became tied to that shift. Blonde, polished, and carefully marketed, Cheryl symbolized something Kate felt was pulling the show away from what it once was. There were no shouting matches or public scenes. Instead, there was distance, a lack of engagement, professional interactions stripped of warmth. That kind of tension doesn't announce itself, but everyone feels it. And once it takes root, it spreads quietly through the room. Cheryl tried to handle the situation the only way she knew how, by working harder and staying professional. She believed that consistency and kindness would eventually earn respect. She didn't complain to producers. She didn't involve the press. She kept telling herself that this was temporary, that television sets are stressful places and personalities clash. But the silence didn't fade. It settled into her daily routine. Crew members noticed the distance almost immediately. When filming stopped, Cheryl often found herself alone, holding her script, waiting for the next call while others moved on together. Power dynamics matter on any set, and Kate's influence was undeniable. When she pulled back, others followed, not out of cruelty, but instinct. No one wanted to be on the wrong side of someone with creative authority. Directors and crew began adjusting without ever acknowledging the problem openly. Scenes were blocked carefully. Interactions were minimized. Long emotional moments between Cheryl and Kate were avoided whenever possible. Nothing was written down, but everyone understood. One crew member later described the atmosphere as walking on ice, where nothing appeared wrong on the surface, yet tension was always present beneath it. Cheryl internalized the experience. She questioned herself constantly. Was she standing in the wrong place, saying the wrong thing, existing too loudly? She was doing everything right on paper, hitting her marks and delivering her lines, yet emotionally she felt misplaced. The irony was painful. While audiences were warming to her, the environment she worked in every day felt colder with each passing week. Jacqueline Smith often found herself caught between both women. She maintained polite relationships and tried to keep things functional, but even she couldn't bridge the emotional gap. When Cheryl and Kate were together, the air shifted. Smiles became tighter. Silences stretched longer. Everyone learned to work around it rather than confront it. For Cheryl, the emotional toll compounded over time. Long hours, relentless scrutiny, and the constant awareness that she wasn't truly welcome began to erode her sense of safety. She didn't feel like part of a team. She felt tolerated, and the stress didn't disappear when filming ended each day. It followed her home, lingering in ways that were difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. As seasons progressed, Cheryl hoped the tension would eventually soften. She told herself patience would be rewarded, but instead of easing, the situation hardened. Creative control became a battleground behind the scenes. Kate was increasingly vocal about her dissatisfaction with the show's direction, wanting deeper scripts and more dramatic weight. When Cheryl was given slightly more emotional material in certain episodes, it felt like validation to her. To Kate, it reportedly felt like displacement. What followed wasn't a public blow-up. It was a private confrontation behind closed doors, away from cameras and headlines. Voices were raised, but what mattered most was the finality. Cheryl didn't attack or accuse. She simply drew a line. Whatever trust might have existed was gone. From that moment forward, the relationship changed completely. Communication became strictly functional and only when required for filming. There were no greetings, no small talk, no effort to repair what had been damaged. The set adjusted accordingly. Everyone understood where the line was and avoided crossing it. Not long after, Kate Jackson made the decision to leave the show. Publicly, it was framed as a creative choice. Privately, those who witnessed the fractured dynamic understood how unbearable the environment had become. For Cheryl, Kate's departure didn't bring relief. It brought confirmation. Confirmation that the silence had never been accidental and that walking away emotionally was the only way to protect herself. Many assumed the tension ended once Kate left, but emotional damage doesn't disappear that easily. Cheryl stayed on the show, carried the franchise forward, and maintained her professionalism. Yet the weight of those years stayed with her. Few people realized how close she had come to breaking. The isolation wasn't just uncomfortable, it was destabilizing. At the same time, Cheryl was navigating deeply personal challenges that never made headlines. She had recently become a mother and was quietly struggling with postpartum depression. Family responsibilities added to the strain, while the demands of a hit television series left no room for vulnerability. Every day required strength, even when she felt fragile. The hostility she experienced didn't exist in isolation. It layered itself onto an already strained emotional state. Cheryl wasn't just trying to succeed professionally. She was trying to survive. Years later, she would admit how overwhelming that period truly was. The silence she chose wasn't avoidance or pride. It was self-preservation. She didn't retaliate. She didn't leak stories. She didn't position herself as a victim. Instead, she focused on what she could control: her work, her family, and her mental health. Over time, that decision solidified into a boundary she never crossed again. Silence became her shield. When reunion opportunities arose years later, Cheryl declined any that involved reopening unresolved wounds. To outsiders, this sometimes appeared cold or distant. In reality, it was deeply intentional. She wasn't interested in revisiting pain for public consumption. The irony is that her silence was often misinterpreted as indifference. But it came from someone who had already given everything she had. She stayed on the show longer than anyone expected and helped sustain its legacy. Emotionally, however, she had already drawn her line. Some relationships aren't meant to be repaired. They're meant to be survived. Decades passed, and the distance between Cheryl and Kate never softened. Fans noticed long before either woman acknowledged it. Reunions, tributes, and retrospectives came and went, and Cheryl's absence at certain events became noticeable. When asked about former castmates, she spoke warmly of Jacqueline Smith and shared genuine memories. But when Kate's name surfaced, her responses became brief and careful. She never attacked. She never embellished. She simply made it clear there was nothing left to revisit. Sometimes, restraint speaks louder than explanation. In the early 2000s, Cheryl reportedly made a quiet attempt to reach out. There was no publicity, no drama, just a simple effort to see if time had changed anything. According to those close to the situation, she never received a response. That silence became its own answer. After that, Cheryl stopped trying altogether. Tabloids continued to frame the situation as ego or bitterness, but that narrative never fully fit. Cheryl's life after the show told a different story. She continued working steadily, expanded into music and writing, and built a stable family life. She didn't define herself by old conflicts. The real shift came much later, when Cheryl finally spoke openly about the emotional context surrounding those years. In a podcast interview, she revealed her struggle with postpartum depression during that time. For the first time, the silence made sense. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't pride. It was protection. Hearing that reframed everything. The tension wasn't just professional. It was layered onto a moment when she was already vulnerable. The strength people saw on screen masked a reality few understood. Looking back, Cheryl's choices reflect quiet resilience rather than bitterness. She chose not to rewrite the past or publicly assign blame. She chose to live beyond it. In an industry that often rewards loud conflicts and public feuds, her restraint stands out. Silence became her way of maintaining control in a situation where she had very little. It allowed her to preserve her dignity and move forward without reopening wounds that never truly healed. This story isn't about villains or heroes. It's about how unspoken tension can be just as damaging as open conflict. It's about how power dynamics shape environments and how silence can be both a weapon and a refuge. Cheryl Ladd's experience reminds us that not all battles are fought loudly. Some are endured quietly over years, until the only option left is to protect what remains of yourself. In the end, Cheryl didn't seek validation or public sympathy. She didn't need applause for her endurance. She built a life beyond the moment that nearly broke her. Her career continued, her family grew, and her sense of self stabilized. The distance she maintained wasn't rooted in anger. It was rooted in self-respect. And sometimes, that's the hardest boundary to hold. Cheryl Ladd's silence was never empty. It was full of meaning, memory, and resolve. It carried the weight of survival, not spite. Decades later, the truth finally surfaced, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet understanding. Some chapters don't end with reconciliation. Some end with acceptance. And in choosing peace over confrontation, Cheryl showed that strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it simply moves forward and never looks back.